The streetlights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered sidewalks of Willow Creek. It was a night like any other in the small town, the kind of night where people huddled indoors, grateful for the warmth and comfort of their homes. But for 17-year-old Ellie Everett, this night was different. Ellie stood at her bedroom window, staring out into the darkness. Her eyes were fixed on the old Victorian house across the street, its turrets and gargoyles looming like skeletal fingers. The house had been vacant for years, its grandeur and beauty slowly being consumed by the passing of time. But it was the window that drew Ellie's attention, the one on the top floor, where a faint light flickered like a firefly on a summer night. She felt an inexplicable pull towards that window, as if something or someone was beckoning her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and a shiver ran down her spine. Ellie's parents thought she was too old for fairy tales, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, waiting for her. The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the trees, and the light in the window seemed to grow brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Ellie's heart raced, her breath fogging the cold glass as she pressed her face against the window pane. And then she saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light, its presence seeming to draw the very darkness itself towards the window. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, yet Ellie felt its gaze upon her, like a cold draft on a winter's night. She tried to step back, to tear her eyes away, but they remained fixed on the window, transfixed by the sense of being seen. The air in her room seemed to thicken, heavy with an unspoken threat. Suddenly, the light in the window vanished, plunging the old house into darkness. The figure, too, was gone. Ellie's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart still racing from the encounter. She told herself it was just her imagination, that the figure was a trick of the shadows, but she knew better. In the silence, Ellie heard her parents' muffled voices drifting from downstairs, their conversation punctuated by the occasional clink of dishes. She felt a pang of longing for the comfort and security they represented, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark window, her mind replaying the event. As she stood there, the shadows in her room seemed to grow, spreading like a stain across the walls. The trees outside creaked and swayed, their branches like skeletal fingers grasping for her attention. Ellie's skin crawled, her senses heightened as if she awaited some signal, some whispered secret that only the darkness knew. And then, a faint scratching began, a soft, deliberate scrape that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, but her room was empty, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until Ellie felt compelled to take a step forward, towards the window. Her hand reached out, as if drawn by an unseen force, and pressed against the glass. The scratching stopped, and in the sudden silence, Ellie felt a presence congregate on the other side of the window. The air vibrated with an unspoken threat, a malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. Beyond the glass, the darkness seemed to coalesce into a face that was not quite a face. Eyes, nose, and mouth dissolved into a twisted, macabre grin, a smile that seemed to revel in Ellie's fear. The face twisted, contorted, and yet remained oddly familiar, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Ellie's hand remained pressed against the glass, her fingers numb, her heart a trip hammer in her chest. She tried to step back, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The face began to change, its features shifting like molten wax, until it was no longer a face at all, but a void, a black hole that seemed to suck the light out of the room. The scratching resumed, louder now, a frantic, desperate rhythm that seemed to be counting down to some unknown event. Ellie's vision began to blur, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer malevolence emanating from the window. She felt herself being pulled towards the glass, her body unwillingly drawn into the abyss. Suddenly, the lights in her room flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The scratching ceased, and an oppressive silence fell over the house. In the darkness, Ellie's ears strained to detect any sound, but there was only the heavy, anticipatory hush that precedes a storm. She stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the window, as the darkness closed in around her like a shroud. The darkness was absolute, a palpable presence that seemed to suffocate her. Ellie's breath came in short, sharp gasps, her heart still racing from the encounter. She strained her ears, trying to detect any sound, any hint of movement from the window. But there was only silence, a silence that seemed to vibrate with tension. As she stood there, her eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and she became aware of a faint, flickering glow. The light emanated from the window, a soft, pulsing rhythm that seemed to be drawing her closer. Ellie's hand, still pressed against the glass, began to tingle, as if the window itself was alive, exerting some sort of strange, hypnotic pull. She felt herself leaning forward, her face inches from the glass, her breath misting the pain. The pulsing light grew brighter, and she could feel its warmth, like a gentle heat, on her skin. The scratching had stopped, but in its place, Ellie could sense a low, almost inaudible hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. The light coalesced into a shape, a figure that seemed to materialize on the other side of the glass. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the face, a face that was both familiar and yet utterly alien. The eyes, dark and empty, seemed to bore into her soul, and Ellie felt a creeping sense of dread as the face began to change, its features shifting and flowing like molten wax. The face stretched, elongated, and then, suddenly, it was gone. The light vanished, plunging the room back into darkness. The hum ceased, and the silence was complete. Ellie's hand remained pressed against the glass, her fingers numb, her heart still racing from the encounter. She stood there, frozen, as the darkness closed in around her, waiting for something, anything. The silence was oppressive, a weight that pressed down upon her. Ellie's breath came in short gasps, her heart still racing from the encounter. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss of unknown terrors. As she stood there, her eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness, she began to sense a presence in the room with her. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible feeling, like a whispered promise in her ear. Ellie's skin crawled, her senses on high alert as she tried to pinpoint the source of the presence. Suddenly, a faint, whispery voice seemed to caress her ear, the words almost inaudible, but the tone unmistakable. Ellie, come closer. The voice was like a sigh, a gentle breeze that sent shivers down her spine. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she spun around, her eyes scouring the darkness for some sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the weight of the presence. The voice seemed to emanate from all around her, echoing off the walls of her room. Her hand, still pressed against the window, began to feel heavy, as if the glass itself was exerting a strange, gravitational pull. Ellie felt herself leaning forward, her face inches from the pain, as if drawn by some unseen force. The presence seemed to grow stronger, more insistent, the voice whispering sweet nothings in her ear. Ellie, come closer. Let me show you. The words trailed off, leaving her with a sense of anticipation, of expectation. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she felt herself being drawn towards the window, the darkness beyond calling to her like a siren's song. She was torn, her mind shouting warnings, her body seemingly under the control of some other, malevolent force. And then, in a moment of decision, she let go of the glass, her hand dropping to her side as she took a step forward, into the darkness. The room seemed to dissolve around her, the shadows coalescing into a dark, velvety tunnel that pulled her forward. Ellie's feet moved of their own accord, her legs carrying her towards the window as if drawn by an unseen force. The presence seemed to swirl around her, a vortex of darkness that whispered sweet nothings in her ear. As she approached the window, the glass seemed to ripple and distort, like the surface of a stagnant pond. Ellie's heart raced, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she felt herself being pulled closer, closer, and then, she was through the window, her body passing through the glass as if it were water. Ellie felt a rush of cold air, a sting of wind that whipped her hair back and forth. She stumbled, her feet landing on a surface that was both solid and yet utterly yielding. As she looked around, she realized she was standing in the attic of the old Victorian house across the street. The air was thick with dust, the shadows cast by the flickering candles like grasping fingers. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure, standing just beyond the reach of the candlelight. The figure was tall, its face a death's mask of pale skin and sunken eyes. It regarded her with a cold, calculating gaze, its presence seeming to fill the room. Ellie tried to step back, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "Welcome, Ellie," the figure whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "I've been waiting for you."